Welcome to Infrastructure Vitoria's first podcast. My name is Michel Masson and I'm the CEO of Infrastructure Vitoria. Today I'm going to talk to you about the journey to refresh the 30-year infrastructure strategy for the whole of Victoria. We plan to table to Parliament that strategy by mid-2020. Now, the first ever 30-year infrastructure strategy for the state of Victoria was produced and tabled in Parliament in December 2016. Since then, that report has been downloaded now more than 17,000 times. So the time is right now to revisit that first ever strategy in light of the first success that we had, and really take into consideration what has changed, what the government has done, in order to come back with a new vision as to what the future will be. Now, revisiting that first strategy is therefore always going to be a very difficult act. So when we embarked upon revisiting the themes that we would consider, we knew that we just didn't want to revisit those recommendations, but actually do something, much bolder, much more ambitious. That's why we landed quickly on two main themes. The first one is, how can we be better at integrating land use planning and infrastructure planning, the holy grail that so many jurisdictions are trying to grapple with? The second thing that we want to be in a position to be is to provide much clearer regional infrastructure priorities. Now, we're very mindful of the extraordinary, unprecedented context in which we embark upon this journey, with the population growth that Victoria has faced over the last couple of years. Last year alone, we welcomed 138,000 new Victorians in the state. Now, put that in perspective, and that's equivalent to growing by more than adding one city of Ballarat to the state. If you look at the forecast, which are always to be taken with a grain of salt, but we are going to be roughly 10 million by 2050. That means Melbourne at 8 million. Now, to be very clear, when I look at those figures in the future, I don't see them, threatening or particularly daunting. I mean, at the end of the day, I was lucky enough to be part of those figures in 2009 when I arrived in Australia. And if I believe the figures from the census 2016, about 30% of you listeners shared the same characteristics and were born abroad. So here's my value proposition to you. We're not overpopulated. We just need to be better organized. And that calls for careful planning and an honest discussion around how and where we should grow. Well, it is precisely to start that conversation that Infrastructure Vitoria released recently our first discussion paper, Growing Victoria's Potential. You will find the discussion paper available on our website to be downloaded. Now, the title says it all, Growing Victoria's Potential. When I see so many countries facing declining population, the demographic cliff, when I look at Victoria, the question is, how do we harness that transformational opportunity to make the most of that population growth in the future? How do we transform that into a competitive advantage by being smarter in how we plan and deliver things? So in order to do that, as we embark upon the 30-year strategy, we will focus on three main themes. The first one is, how do we make the most of the existing regions in Victoria? How do we capitalize on regional Victoria? The second theme is, what's the right level of density in a growing Melbourne? And the third theme is, how do we make sure that we've got the right infrastructure at the right place in order to accompany where people want to live and grow? Let me unpack now each one of those three themes one by one, starting with the regions. Well, interestingly, about 1 in 4 Victorians live in regional Victoria today. And yet, there's been, less than 12% of the population growth since 1990, which benefited regional Victoria. Now, when we talk about regional Victoria, we're very mindful that we're talking about a very rich and diverse portfolio of situations. Every region is different, with its own competitive advantages and strength, but also its challenges and pockets of disadvantages. Even within each region, we should differentiate between the regional cities, which are growing, the peri-urban areas, and the rural areas, which are facing their own challenges. It is to get a better sense of that diversity and recognize it that Infrastructure Victoria has published recently, again available on the website, 9 regional profiles for the 9 regions that we've identified in Victoria, together with 6 metropolitan profiles for consistency. Now, those regional profiles look at the social, environmental, and economic attributes for each region. But most importantly, it identifies what are the comparative competitive advantages that those regions can boast from, and what are the disadvantages that they are facing. The next step for us will then to be able to develop an assessment framework, something that has been called for by the Productivity Commission, by the Harper Review, in order to have a filter through which to look at the infrastructure options to make sure that we will be in a position to prioritize what infrastructure reforms and priorities will be necessary in the regions in order to enhance what they're very good at, but also tackle the disadvantages. Indeed, we feel very strongly that investments in region should happen for the right reasons. And we can't think of a better reason than investing in making the regions better at what they're already good at, whilst also thinking about what potential new opportunities the future could bring. But also, without shying away, looking at what investment is needed in order to tackle the disadvantages that those regions are facing. Taking pressure off Melbourne will only be a subset, a consequence indirectly of being successful at implementing this regional growth strategy. Which brings me to the second theme. What's the right level of density in a growing Melbourne? Well, interestingly, did you know that Melbourne doesn't even make it in the top 100 cities in the world when it comes to population? But we are in the top 30 when you look at the urban footprint. Yes, that says that we are a low-density city by a large cry, and likely to remain so in the future. And yet, infrastructure is not provided in the same way everywhere. And that's the big dilemma that we're facing. It's not by chance that in the context of releasing the 2016 30-year infrastructure strategy, we came out with one of the top 3 transformative recommendations being, let's increase quality medium-sized density in established areas along transport corridors. As we revisit this recommendation, I suspect that it's likely to be as vivid and forceful as it was in 2016. Indeed, if we can encourage quality medium-sized density living in parts of Victoria where there is capacity and key infrastructure, it brings people closer to their jobs, schools, services, and makes the most of our existing assets. Interestingly, our research shows that the cost of providing infrastructure in greenfield areas can be 2 to 4 times higher than in established areas where there is extra capacity to accommodate the growth. That brings me to probably what will be the most important discussion to be had in the next 18 months with the community, and that is, how do we balance the trade-offs between the infrastructure that people want and the level of density needed to support it? That, as I said, is for me the most important discussion to be had. Which brings me to the third theme. How do we make sure that we got the right infrastructure at the right place at the right time in order to accommodate and accompany where people want to live and work? Well, it starts by recognizing that the right infrastructure is not necessarily new infrastructure. Indeed, we came out again in 2016 very strongly saying that we should look first and foremost on how we manage the demand on our existing assets. How do we make the most of what we already have? Through asset management, leveraging on technology, doing things differently, before we look at investing into new assets. This will even be more important in the future as we see a growing shift between where people live and where they work. Did you know that by 2050, More than half of the Melburnians will live in the outer growth areas. Now, by comparison, the middle ring will only grow about that half, and yet is much richer in existing infrastructure able to accommodate capacity in the future. And yet, 2 in 3 jobs in the future will be in the inner and the middle rings. How we tackle that trade-offs necessary to be considered between the infrastructure that we want and the level of density able to accommodate it will be fundamental in getting that better integration between land use planning and infrastructure planning. How we make the most of the existing regions, connect them, and enable them to be attractive and to be better at what they're at will also be fundamental in our ability to make the most of the opportunities that we've got for the future. So for all of those reasons, we need to think differently. And Stein is credited to have said, craziness is the art of doing the same thing again and again, thinking you're going to get a different outcome. I would say that this will be prominent in our mind as we embark upon this 30-year strategy. Not just to accommodate for the population growth, but to make the most of that extraordinary chance that we have to live in the state and continue to make that state the place to be. Thank you.